Our text tonight will be Ephesians 4:28. It's a verse that probably most of us know by memory, just from having heard it quoted and read a number of times, although it's not maybe one of those on the list of those that we teach our children to memorize. Ephesians 4 and verse 28. Let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. I didn't learn it that way. I learned it in King James Version, I think. The word's a little bit different, but this is good. It's good wording. It's very clear, very understandable. Simply that when you put off the old man and you put on the new man, one of the things that you put off is thievery. Not that we are a bunch of thieves who or formerly were thieves and have had, but there are many aspects to this verse I want to recommend to your thinking tonight. Basic principles. He says, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. That he might have, and just in case that the translators had added that word, I went ahead and looked it up in the Greek language, and sure enough, the word for have, ego, is the word that's here. Now the word have demands a concept, very fundamental, that the Bible does support. And it's a foundation of declaring what's wrong with thievery. If you have something, God says, when you work, then you have something. That means you have a right to privately own that thing. You personally own what you have earned. Okay? You own it. It's yours. It's not anybody else's. And so in Acts 5 and verse 4, even in the context of the church, when brethren in chapter 4, like Barnabas, they were selling a possession, or their possession, that which they had, and bringing in the proceeds to the feet of the apostles to be distributed to the poor. You have Ananias and Sapphira who conspire to lie about what they present. They're going to present a very generous donation of half of what they have gained from selling their property, and they've kept half, but they're going to lie about it, and they're going to say that all of it has been given. And Peter's point to him in Acts 5 and verse 4 is, while it remained unsold, did it not remain your own? It belonged to them. It was theirs. It didn't belong to anybody else. God did not say to them when they became Christians that they no longer had a right to possess anything. Now, in Acts chapter 2, we do read that in the beginning, nobody considered them in their own heart and mind that what they owned belonged to them. They had all things in common. It says here, and that's in the last few verses here of Acts 2. He says, verse 44, all who believed were together and had all things in common, and they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. Now, they were doing that not because the gospel, obviously, the gospel did not require that. It might seem so, and there are those who have argued that the gospel required that all of the Christians should sell what they owned and give to the poor. The Lord had told the rich young ruler that back at Matthew 19. That if he wanted to be perfect, if he wanted to be a follower of Jesus, that he was a rich man. And Jesus said, that's one thing that you lack is you need to go and sell all that you own, give the poor, and come follow me. And the disciples had actually left everything and followed Jesus. Peter and the apostles observed that. Well, they had done something like that, in that they had left their businesses and they had come to follow Jesus. It's a voluntary thing. We noticed in the scriptures, 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, that in the weekly gatherings, and we do have in this particular chapter, we have a pattern laid out for the Christians to come together, to assemble on the first day of the week. The whole idea of a church, and I know you had that lesson this morning, I did too back there. We had Sam and I are on the same wavelength. But we didn't conspire to do this, but we talked about the church this morning, I understand. But the idea of the church implies that Christians congregate. And they do that according to a pattern. Well, when do they do that? Well, here we have an example. Here we have an instruction. They would come together on the first day of the week, and he tells them, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do on the first day of every week. Each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. So they were to take collections in advance of the arrival of Paul, and that was to be something he was instructing all the churches, that when they come together, they should make an offering. Now, he says, as you may prosper. He didn't tell them how much, and he didn't tell them to give all of what they make, but they were to judge. And so in 2 Corinthians, in chapters 8 and 9, he deals in more detail with some of the principles of this giving, as he says in verse 2, for in a severe test of affliction their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. Now, if they were commanded to give all, there would be no place for generosity on their part. They were able to, of their own heart, as they had prospered, he says, for they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means, of their own free will. Okay? They were not commanded to do this. They gave this of their own free will. And he lays down the principle in verse 6 of chapter 9. The point is this: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must give as he has made up his mind, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work. Verse 10, he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way for all your generosity, which through us will produce thanksgiving to God. So God supplies, God gives us supplies of seed, that from the example of the farmer, that we may invest. They invest what God supplies them. You understand, you could eat the seed. That's a part of what they have that they don't eat, because they invest it in the following year. Why do they do that? Well, they have a hope of harvest, and who will it belong to? It belonged to the farmer. It belonged to us because we invested, and so we shall have the harvest, and God will multiply that. God's not against the idea of a multiplied harvest, and He promises to those who are generous in giving what they own, to other spiritual causes that God will multiply their resources. That's not a fanciful notion. This is a divine idea that God does prosper those who sacrifice for Him. Now, you would think that in general, I'm saying things that are common sense that everybody knows and everybody understands. And it's not so today. Okay? Now, we have a growing movement, several growing movements, but there's one in particular that is a reaction to the crass materialism of our age. And I lived through some of that in my high school days, and where there was a lot of resentment among the younger generation against their parents who were working every possible hour of the day, both the mother and the father, and they never saw their parents. And there was this kind of rebellion against the whole idea of crass materialism. And so the so-called hippie movement and such in California began to develop in a big way. And a lot of what they had to say was, of course, true. A lot of the complaints that they had were based upon a reality, and you can understand the complaint, but they were young, and they were naive, and they were being seduced into a new religion, and they didn't even know it. And that religion has grown a great deal since those days, some 50 years ago. And we have a young generation today that's going through the very same thing. And they find it very attractive to follow these thoughts. That's one movement. There's another movement reacting to that movement that is called the Anabaptist. And the Hutterites, they have recently joined forces. And I would say it's a very tempting movement to me. I mean, I'd like to look into it and see how it's working out for them. But they have a fundamental assumption about the gospel that's wrong. And their assumption is that every Christian should give up his right to private ownership. That he should give up every dime that he makes in his employment and put it into a common fund. And of course, that would be a form of what was called and has been called communism. That is to live in a commune. Although the hippie idea of a commune was also to share possession of husbands and wives. And it's not that far away. We have much of that mentality today. The idea of possession and ownership and private rights is fundamental to the order that God has given us here. Now, when you depart from that, you can justify what Bible condemns as immorality. Immorality, not just in the idea of thievery. Now, thievery is fundamental. We've looked at that in Ephesians 4 and verse 28. We understand a thief does what? Okay, a thief, well, he first envies what somebody else has. He wants what somebody else has that he doesn't have. Why doesn't he have something like that? Well, maybe he's just ugly. Maybe he's just lazy. Or maybe he has been born at the wrong time, at the wrong place, and had bad luck, and maybe he hasn't had opportunity. Maybe that's all true. But that doesn't change the fact that for whatever reason, when someone steals what belonged to somebody else, if it belongs to them, it's not ours, we in our conscience know that's wrong. And I don't care whether you're a Christian or what. All men have fundamentally understood this at all times. That what does not belong to you, you don't have a right to steal from somebody else. It takes a lot of indoctrination to destroy that feeling of guilt that anyone will have when they steal from somebody else. It's kind of like adultery. Now, we've been having the propaganda for 50 years and better, on television and on the movies and in the magazines and the novels, in the universities, railing against the injustice of marriage and of the home, and how that enslaves the woman, and how she's not free to realize her potential, and the slavery and the drudgery of having to raise the children while the husband's off working. Railing against marriage has allowed people to justify adultery as well as fornication before, because what is marriage? It's just a piece of paper. Those are all very clever excuses and justifications and doctrines. They are false doctrines that are being preached in many places all over our land and throughout the world. Now, the solution of the Anabaptists and the Hutterites is not the right solution. What they do good is that they are very devoted to the home and the family. And they live a lifestyle very similar to the Amish and the Mennonites, and they reject all the trappings of economic success and materialism and modern inventions in order to focus on what is right and good for the home and for their God. And I appreciate that very much. And they serve as a great example that we ourselves can benefit from, to realize what really matters after all is said and done. Why do you work? Why do you prosper? Because you work to provide for your family, not to become some great and powerful potentate. But in order for you to provide for your children, to provide for your wife, and to give them a future to whatever degree that you can. So you work hard, and you work with industry. This is a matter of maturity. It's a matter of manhood in order to achieve those goals. Now, with this context in mind, I'd like us to try to think about first how important the lesson is throughout the Bible that we understand what's wrong with thievery. Does it matter if some people are rich and some people are poor? Does the poor man have a right to rob from the rich? This new religion, and it's not new, of course, but the religion that was born in the Victorian era, in mid-1800s, that Marxist theology began to be developed and propagated throughout the world. This theology stated that world history is dominated by the oppressed and the oppressor. There you have all the great power of the oppressor. This is the rich man. This is the powerful man. And you can see the sympathy that people have toward this particular argument, very strong in the Spanish-speaking countries. And the Marxist movement that was born back then is very popular and very strong all over South America and Central America. But it's very strong here. It's very strong in Europe. It's strong throughout the world because it appeals to the greed and the, covetousness. Codicia. It is a word that describes envy and the desire to have what the wealthy people have, to live like the wealthy, to live like the kings and the queens and the princes and the princesses. And so you're sitting here and you don't have what they have and you resent it, and somebody comes and they feed that resentment. They feed it and they feed it. And they talk about how unjust the world is, causing most men and women to be oppressed. It's all about oppression. And they use the same kind of of argument to speak to the women about how that in marriage the men oppress the women. It's Marxist theology. We don't see it as that. It doesn't present itself as a religion or as a theology, but it is an argument contrary to the pattern of Christ. What did Christ say? He walked among the poor. What did Christ say? Did Christ raise up an army? Did Christ stir his disciples into a political movement like the guerrilla warfare of modern times of the poor against the rich? He could have. They would have followed him, but he didn't. He taught morality. He taught that it's wrong to steal, even if you're stealing from the rich and the powerful. Many felt like that they had that right. There was the zealot movement of the Jews who felt it right for them to take the life of a soldier who was working for the Romans, or even of the fellow Jews who worked as tax collectors. They were evil. They were oppressors, and you had a right to take what was theirs because they didn't have a right for what they did. And it shocks me to hear people in modern times use that very same language, and they justify petty theft, pilfering, or dishonesty, or fraud based upon that premise. So the idea of the rich and the poor has always been with us. James, what chapter is it? Chapter 4? Chapter 5? James devotes a whole chapter to the injustice, and he rebukes soundly those who are the rich among the brethren, or wherever they might be. He says, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you." Miseries from where? Not from a rebellion of Christians against them, but rather from God. He says, "Your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned. You have murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you." Okay, catch that. Who is the righteous person? It's the Christian. That's the righteous person. He does not resist you. And Jesus, even there in Matthew 5 in the Sermon on the Mount, when he spoke of being abused, he says, aside from the idea of if someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer him the left. What about those who would impose upon you an obligation, that you walk with them a mile, as the soldiers could do to the Jews of that time? He says, walk with them too. Be generous even with the oppressor. That was Jesus' message. And God will take care of the oppressor. There will be a day of judgment for that. But there's a greater danger whenever we use our boiling resentment. I mean, there in James 5, can you not capture why? Why there is so much resentment toward the oppressor and the abuser? But you understand that the reason, what we do in order to justify our dishonesty and our fraud, we have to lie. Okay? We have to lie about it. When you involve yourself in theft, you not only enter into a game in which you cause justice, and what do they call it today? Social justice. Watch out for the term. It's a religious term. It's not a Bible term, although there are preachers who use the word. But social justice is used to inflame our passions about the injustice of the people who possess too much, more than we do anyway. And so therefore, it's just not fair. It's not just. Life is not fair. Culture and society is not fair. The reason that many people all over the world hate and resent Americans, aside from all of the things that we've done wrong in our history, but it's because of this belief system which dwells on and on and on about those who don't have as much as being the oppressed, and the rest of them being the oppressor. And so therefore they are justified in stealing and being dishonest. All right, now we get into the whole idea of truth. Telling the truth, being honest, having honest dealings one with another. Loving your neighbor as yourself. Who's your neighbor? Is a rich man your neighbor? Is a powerful man your neighbor? Are you to love him too? Absolutely. That was Jesus' message. We must not forget that. Now, in all of this discussion, we get back to the idea that fundamentally faith is about truth. In the Hebrew language, the word faith it is rooted, the very root of the word faith is the root of the word truth. And so that's why faith in God means being faithful to God. It's being true to God, as God is true. In the Psalms, God is called faithful. God is called truth. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. What do you mean by that? How is Jesus the truth? In the same way that Jehovah God in the Psalms is the truth. True and faithful. We don't lie. We don't break our promises. We are faithful to our God. We are true and we are loyal, and nobody can provoke us to be a fraud, to lie, to deceive, to cheat, for whatever reason. We don't do that. We cannot do that because we are true to our God as God is true. God does not use lies and fraud in His government of our planet, of our land, our world. God is true and faithful. His principles of morality are the same from Genesis to Revelation. So we have in Exodus 20 and verse 15, thou shalt not steal. And then in Exodus 21, he goes into detail. Thou shalt not steal a man. You do that, and the penalty was death. Verse 3, well, in those verses, he says, if you steal an ox and you get caught, you owe that man 5 oxen. If you steal a sheep, you owe that man 4 sheep. Now, that's a very strong and harsh law, but it was one that made a point. And the point was, it is wrong to steal. Full restitution. If they could not make it, the law of Moses allowed them, required them to sell the person into slavery to that individual that they had stolen from. Now, you have coveted what they had. Now you are their slave. You are their possession. Now, under the law of Moses, of course, if they were Israelites, that slavery might be limited by the year of Jubilee. Their debts and their slavery were limited to 7 years, and then 7 times 7, then you get into the 50th year of Jubilee, in which everything would go back to what it was to begin with. Look in Proverbs 6 and verse 30. You understand that this principle of truth and loyalty, as opposed to fraud and theft. It has ramifications always beyond just the idea of stealing. Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 30. He says, people do not despise a thief if he steals to satisfy his appetite when he is hungry. But if he is caught, he will pay sevenfold. He will give all the goods of his house. He who commits adultery lacks sense. He who does it destroys himself. Wounds and dishonor will he get, and his disgrace will not be wiped away. For jealousy makes a man furious, and he will not spare when he takes revenge. He will accept no compensation. He will refuse, though you multiply gifts. Now, I understand that in our times, we have so destroyed the idea of marriage that we don't have this legal sense or right to think of marriage as giving two people possession of one another. That is, that's ridicule. That there might be possession. That doesn't matter. The reality is, no matter where you go in the world, that when one man commits adultery with the wife of another man, he's taking his own life in his hands, depending on how that man thinks and how he feels. Because a man can be enraged by that, and he can very easily become a murderer of that man. Those are just principles of reality. Now, all this game that we're playing today, it's all connected. A part of the philosophy of those years, back 50 years ago, when these ideas were being preached against the idea of private possession, came the idea of relativism, situation ethics. There is no sin because there's no God. You understand, humanism rejects the Bible as the Word of God. And so this way of thinking says there is no God to condemn you. There is no church to condemn you. That's all something to be dismissed, because those who are smart, those who are educated, those who really know what's going on realize that the truth is not absolute, that even marriage is not absolute. There's exceptions. There's just like there is there's times when you ought to lie. You ought to commit adultery. You ought to steal. You ought to defraud. And of course, they always bring up the idea, well, what about, when we were fighting the Nazis in World War II? And what about the woman who agreed to sleep with the guard who was guarding her husband, held in prison by the Nazis, and he was dying of hunger, and she wanted to get food to him, and so here you have the end justifies the mean. There is no absolute. How can you condemn the woman for committing adultery? How about murder? Is murder always wrong? Well, maybe not. Maybe not. When you start tearing down the laws and the rules of God, there is no end to it. And that is true, going back basically to the idea of theft. Now, one of the thoughts that kind of brought this all up to me was something that happened during this week. The president of Harvard was dismissed or resigned, or I'm not sure how to describe exactly what happened there, but obviously she was fired. Why was she fired? She was fired for plagiarism. What's wrong with that? Why is that such a big deal? Plagiarism. That just means that as she wrote a document she pretended that she had written the words, but actually she had stolen the words from somebody else. Now, that word stolen. Okay, there is where we're getting down to the principle where a lot of our generation does not see there much wrong. If there's nothing really wrong with stealing, you don't have a right to what you have. What's so wrong about plagiarism in a university? Well, think about what she did, okay? She was elevated to this position of president of a prestigious university. The young people who get their degrees, their doctoral degrees or whatever, from Harvard, can boast as they apply for work elsewhere, everywhere they go, that degree is worth something. It's worth thousands of dollars. Why is it worth that? Because it's assumed that there is a high level of scholarship in the university, and in order to achieve presidency of that university, of course, she had to have achieved something with her own studies, research, writing, something in her writing. Well, when it turns out that the papers that she had composed that gave her esteem, therefore value, and whatever that salary, I'm sure it's a six-figure salary, it was worth money, okay? How did she achieve that status? By stealing the writings of others to give her value, to give her esteem. The Marxist, from the Victorian era until our time now, banks on the honors that are fundamentally based on fraud. And there is no conscience for them to be dishonest. We depend upon our universities to provide the quote-unquote scientists. They are scientists with their degrees, and so therefore, when they say something, when they write something, it can be worth a lot of money for a certain field of manufacturing in the area of medicine or engineering or physics or nearly any, in practical terms, all fields of science. And so as we're considering this, I'd like you to go with me to Psalm 49 and verse 16. He says in the Psalm, be not afraid when a man becomes rich, when the glory of his house increases. For when he dies, he will carry nothing away. His glory will not go down after him. Okay? The power of the man that might cause someone to fear is the glory that he has. In other translations is, do not be envious of the glory of this other man. There is power in the glory of others. Now, how does Jesus help us not envy and wish to steal from someone else their glory? Look in Romans 12 and verse 15. Here is what the gospel teaches us in verse 14. Romans 12:14. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be conceited. In this he says, rejoice with those who rejoice. Can you do that? Your brother, your sister, your neighbor, your friend, or maybe someone's your enemy. He is honored. He's rejoicing in some accomplishment. Can you rejoice with him? The gospel teaches us to rejoice with them. That's hard. But in 1 Corinthians 13, we are told the nature of the love that the gospel teaches us grants us the virtue and the power to do precisely that. Love, verse 4, love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not envy or boast. So, how did they receive their glory? They were working, going back to Ephesians 4 and 28, working with their hands, creating something. When these doctoral candidates were preparing their thesis, how many hours do you suppose that they worked in their composition of their thesis? Hours and hours and hours. Doing what? Studying, doing research, forming their thoughts. They were working hard. They were working with their mind and their hands and with all the faculties that God had given them. And when they got done, they composed a piece of work, theoretically of great value, which was then judged by a group of their peers. Now, personally, I don't have a lot of respect for that. But you can't deny that that has value that they have earned because they have worked at it. And what if somebody plagiarizes that? How much work did they do? Well, they stole those hours of work from the one who did the research. How about someone has spent hours and hours working on a melody? They're going to compose a melody. Maybe an arrangement in which there are all the instruments of an orchestra. And they have written this music. And now an orchestra plays the music. And the music is beautiful. And others see that. And they plagiarize it. And they put their name on it. And they sell it. And they make money off of it. What is that? It's theft. They're stealing. Well, it's just an idea. I mean, what's wrong with stealing an idea? It's not that you're stealing an idea. You're stealing somebody's work. That is an issue right now all over the world. We've had a history, and I know my time is about gone. The Soviet Union, during all these years, when I was in my youth, until in the 80s, I guess, whenever it was dissolved as a nation. Here you had a living demonstration of the religion of humanism. And the religion was that there is nothing wrong with lying and fraud. There's nothing wrong with stealing that which belonged to somebody else. Every invention of any great fame, every composition of any great value in the United States was stolen by the Soviet Union, and it was completely okay. They stole Winnie the Pooh. I just gave him a new name. Can you believe that? They stole, in other words, they saw the American film industry making millions of dollars in the world, and so they just stole it and changed it a little bit and tried to cash in on it. The fact is, though, you cannot build success on thievery. What happened to the Soviet Union? It collapsed. It did not prosper. You cannot prosper with lies and envy and jealousy and all of this negativity. China is doing the same thing, has been doing. They've been stealing all of the American technology. They steal it. They have knockoffs of every great product made in the U.S. The iPhone, they have their knockoffs. The fashions from the clothing industry, they have their knockoffs. Everything produced of any value here is stolen. What good is it doing China? They're collapsing. Okay? Why? They're thieves. Now, the fact is that a thief steals the hard work and the industry of honest labor. And the Lord condemns that as evil. There is no way to justify it. Let's see what I have left out here. I said no. I appreciate so much your attention during this exam. I'm wrestling with this thought. The more I think about it, the more ways I see in which we suffer from self-imposed injuries when we engage in sin. When we engage in sin, it destroys our lives. This is what humanism has done all over the world. It's destroyed nations. It's destroyer, destroyer, destroyer. What is it that Satan is called in the book of Revelation? Apollyon. What does that mean? Destroyer. That's what he is. Satan is a destroyer. There's nothing about his religion that will bless or build up anybody. Christ urges us to love our neighbor as ourselves, to sacrifice ourselves for others. Are we destroying ourselves? No. He that would lose his life shall find it. That's the great message of Jesus Christ. If you want to be a disciple of Christ, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow Jesus. This is how you achieve success, not just in physical terms, but in eternal terms. This is how you build character, how you build love, how you build joy, how you build the kind of prosperity that God wants us to have. We forget that, and we don't gain anything, and we don't find any hope to look forward to. We have a generation today committing suicide in numbers that would astound you. Young people who have nothing to live for because they don't know this message of Jesus. If you're not serving this Jesus, you're missing out on something very good. Would you not think with us, would you not consider of turning over your future to his hands? As we stand together, as we sing, would you come?